Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. President Trump announcing a primetime address to the nation as Vice President J.D. Vance heads to Pennsylvania to talk affordability, and the two Kevins find company. With finalist interviews for Fed Chair now on the docket, we'll bring you live to the White House. Plus, Chief Unfiltered, the White House reacting now to Susie Wiles' stunningly candid interviews with Vanity Fair. Everything from Trump's alcoholic personality to his desire for retribution, internal disagreements over tariffs. And what are Trump's true intentions when it comes to Venezuela? There's a lot to unpack this evening. Also tonight, a matter of national security. The White House latest argument for why it is ballroom renovation is needed. And the breaking news as we come to air. Netflix heading out now and beating Paramount. The news tonight as Warner Brothers Discovery plans to reject Paramount's hostile takeover bid, expected to tell shareholders to stick with Netflix. Romaine Bostick will have more in tonight's Power Moves. But we do begin this evening, as mentioned, with the White House on offense. The president announcing he will be addressing the nation tomorrow from the White House, giving no details on the speech other than, quote, "It has been a great year for our country, and the best is yet to come." That post coming after Vice President J.D. Vance was dispatched to Pennsylvania in a bid to push a message of economic success on behalf of the administration. The event coming just hours after November payrolls were released, showing signs of a fragile labor market. 64,000 jobs created in November, an unemployment rate rising to the highest in 4 years. Still, Vance celebrated the administration's economic successes before the crowd in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Listen.
What we have been able to do, higher wages, lower inflation, a massive amount of investment and money coming into the United States of America, that stuff is incredible. And that is something to be proud of. What I will say is that given how bad things got under the Biden administration, we are going to keep on working every single day to make sure that Americans feel the benefits of the Trump economy.
All right, joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove, who is reporting live from the White House North Lawn. Josh, what can you tell us about this?
Well, President Trump, as you know, has sort of gone back and forth between saying whether there is an affordability crisis or not right now, sort of insisting that prices are coming down and that affordability as a political argument is a hoax or by the Democrats. And so, you know, Vance is sort of trying to bridge Trump world with what the rest of the data are showing. And he's saying, look, Rome won't be built in a day. He used that phrase multiple times today, Joe, saying that we know that there are problems and that they're working to bring them down. Of course, he's trying to thread a bit of a tricky needle here, right? Because there are open questions in particular of the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs on those price levels. He talked a bit about that and said that they're sort of punishing companies that refuse to make things in America. In other words, defending the tariff levels to cheers from the otherwise pretty friendly crowd. So Vance is essentially going on offense here to seize the affordability issue and fight back, but there is a bit of a different tone between them. Again, Vance focusing more on, yes, we know it's bad right now, the progress is being made and we're working on it. Trump sort of trying to sort of explain away some of the fears right now, and I expect we'll hear a lot from Trump about this tomorrow in that national address you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, we don't have a sense, I guess, of really what this timing is all about here, Josh, but pretty fascinating to read insights on the inner workings of this White House from Susie Wiles in a series of interviews that became quite a splash today in Vanity Fair. I think she talked about just about everything except the economy, although she did touch on tariffs as well. The White House and the president himself quick to come to Wiles' defense. Is there anyone else in the administration who could get away with such candid remarks?
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find them. It seems like the entire cabinet has given statements of support, Vice President Vance as well. So people are rallying, I suppose, around her right now. It's kind of an open question as to what they thought was the scenario here, right? She sat for 11 on-record interviews. These came out. No one's really disputing that the comments were made. They're saying that there were sins of omission in the reporting. So, you know, we'll see that fall where it may. On the tariffs thing with Susie, I think that is interesting. She says that they've been more painful than she expected. Remember, the White House kind of under the radar announced some exclusions, a fairly broad range of them not too long ago. I suppose there's an open question about whether they would continue to do that or continue to slow walk some of the sectoral tariffs that have been promised but not really landed yet. So she pulled back and indicated that some people, including Vice President Vance, she said, had sort of reservations about some of these tariff measures that the president was taking. So until now, they have not said that publicly. So I think that that is an interesting thing that came out under some of the more flashy and sort of jaw-dropping revelations at the top of that. It was a stunner of an interview here from Susie Wiles, but as of now, they seem to have put Trump on the phone with the New York Post, for example. There's no indication right now that she's about to be pushed out. Remember, Trump moved through chiefs of staff pretty quickly, of course, in the first term. So there'll be maybe a little bit of an eye, shall we say, in the coming days on whether those statements of support continue to flow or if that slows to a trickle.
This is why many were wondering if it was an exit interview. We were reading Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove reporting live from the White House. Thank you, Josh, for the great reporting. And breaking news, just before the close today, Warner Brothers Discovery is planning to reject Paramount's hostile takeover bid due to concerns about financing and other terms, according to people familiar with the matter. For details and more on today's overall market action, we turn to Power Moves with Romaine Bostick, who's with us live from New York. Romaine?
Yeah, Joe, I mean, this day actually started out with much more focus on the macro, but as you just alluded to, as we got towards the closing bells here, a flurry of news crossing the wire with regards to the bidding for Warner Brothers Discovery. Here's the lay of the land. We knew that Netflix had a deal on the table, roughly about $80 billion, a deal that at least Netflix said was largely funded by either its own cash, its own stock, or its own debt. Paramount Skydance would, of course, also come in with its own hostile bid, valued at more than $100 billion, but there were a lot of questions about whether they actually had the money sewn up to make that deal a deal. Jared Kushner was a big part of that. His affinity partners was said to be backing that and also said to be bringing along potentially some money from some of Jared Kushner's friends over in the Middle East. But we learned a little bit earlier today that Affinity Partners, Jared Kushner's firm, is pulling out at that deal, basically saying that at least for right now, financially, it does not make sense. There was also a separate report by Bloomberg that suggested that Warner Brothers Discovery at some point this week will formally ask its shareholders to back the Netflix deal. So based on all that, Joe, just based on what we know about the shareholder side of this, it does appear that this deal could now be in the lap of Netflix. But of course, there's one big asterisk, and I think he sits just a few blocks away from you, Joe, and that is what President Trump and his antitrust chiefs actually want. Gail Slater, of course, is the main person there at the Justice Department who will have to take a look at this and maybe potentially raise some antitrust concerns. Antitrust concerns, whether legitimate or not, we should point out, could have an impact. All you have to do is remember the last time Warner Brothers was trying to have a big deal, of course, that big tie-up with AT&T back during the first Trump administration, and antitrust concerns that were raised then, antitrust concerns that scuttled that deal then as well.
While we're talking M&A here, let's throw another log on the fire, Romaine. This just crossed the terminal. Spirit Airlines eyeing a merger with Frontier amid bankruptcy. Here we go again.
Yeah, I mean, this has been speculated a lot about in the market here. You have two airlines that, to a large degree, frankly, need each other. The lower end spectrum of the airline industry has been struggling. When you talk to the Deltas and Uniteds and Americans of the world, all they talk about is premium economy, or first class, business class. Even a company like Southwest Airlines, which has always been seen as a budget carrier, now moving into higher pricing tiers. And that's really left behind those names like Spirit, those names like Frontier, and a lot of them see the only way they see the potential for survival is greater scale, the idea of a mashup here. And that report now crossing the wire, citing people familiar with the situation, that they are intensely looking at a tie-up between Spirit and Frontier. Not quite sure what the antitrust implications would be, if at all, but certainly from an investor standpoint, and more importantly from a creditor standpoint, it does appear that they would welcome this.
A lot of news this evening, Romaine. Thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Back here in Washington, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says he will not make public the full unedited video of the so-called double-tap strike on an alleged drug boat leaving Venezuela back in September. This after the Pentagon briefed all members of Congress on the military buildup in the Caribbean.
In keeping with long-standing Department of War policy, Department of Defense policy, of course, we're not going to release a top-secret full unedited video of that to the general public. Hask and Sask and appropriate committees will see it, but not the general public.
But of course, President Trump did say initially that he had no problem with releasing the video to the public, only to walk back that remark and leave it up to Hegseth. Joining us now with more details in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg's Erik Martin, who covers foreign policy and diplomacy. Erik, lawmakers, at least some of them, will see that video later this week.
That's right, Joe. We expect for Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth to be back briefing lawmakers from the Armed Services Committees of the House and Senate tomorrow. Today they had the Intelligence Committees. What I thought was actually quite striking, you saw that video there. We were in the subway of the Capitol with the two secretaries and a number of senators coming through as well. We had a chance to speak with Senator Lindsey Graham, and he said that he still is unclear about what the administration is ultimately trying to do in Venezuela. I thought that was striking given Graham's relationship with President Trump. We've seen them as golf buddies, and that Graham is still confused. He said if the objective is to take out Maduro, he supports that, but he's not clear that that is the objective. And so looking for a more thorough and comprehensive explanation of what the ultimate U.S. goal is in Venezuela.
Well, suggesting maybe that wasn't the most comprehensive briefing today, then.
Well, we certainly saw, for example, Senator Murphy talk about the fact that he felt like it was a very brief briefing, short briefing, and that they didn't have an opportunity to really delve into some of the tougher questions that some of the lawmakers had.
Yeah, Erik, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Erik Martin with us live in Washington. For more on these latest developments coming out of the Caribbean, we turn to a voice of experience in Rebecca Grant, Vice President of the Defense Programs at the Lexington Institute. Doctor, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. You've got great sources on the Hill. Did these lawmakers learn anything today that they hadn't heard otherwise as the administration tries to make the case?
And note, they've already had 20 other briefings. So what they'll have learned today is that we really have exquisite, great maritime intelligence. Therefore, they were hitting the right boats. The question over the legality and the policy wisdom, well, that's going to divide on partisan lines. But there's no question that President Donald Trump, as commander-in-chief, has declared these to be enemy combatants, and that's the legal justification. They're sticking by that.
That's when it comes to the boat strikes themselves. Was there a more effective argument for the overall operation? As Erik just mentioned, you've got senators as high-ranking, as senior as Lindsey Graham, who's a friend of President Trump, still not sure if this is about regime change or something short of that.
And Lindsey Graham himself, a former Air Force officer. I think what's startling here is this attention to the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's all over the new national security strategy. And Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, has said, look, we are going to protect our neighborhood and clean up our neighborhood. And all the documents are there, whether it's from Treasury, State, et cetera, designating the cartels, putting the focus on their massive narco-trafficking, the huge number of deaths from drugs in our country. And then, of course, as we know, pushing back on getting the influence of China and Russia and Venezuela's other buddies out of this region, too.
Members of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee will see the video of the second strike at some point later this week. I don't know if a day has been determined yet. We heard from Chuck Schumer, of course, the Democratic leader in the Senate, about potentially making a wider audience available. Here's what he said.
This morning I demanded in front of every senator, to Hegseth's face, that he let every senator see the unedited video of what happened on September 2nd. I've seen it. It turns your stomach. It is awful. And people should see it. What the hell is Hegseth hiding?
That's pretty dramatic, and obviously, to your point, we have political implications when we hear the remarks from lawmakers on Wall Street. But why not make this public, as the president initially said would be all right?
Well, that is very dramatic. You know, I can't say that I blame him in this case. I think showing the full video to those carefully selected members of the House and the Senate is the right move. Again, they want to do it at a classified level. This is an active intelligence operation, and it may be frustrating to us, but they're not going to reveal the details of what platforms are watching, what platforms are executing, and how we're getting all of this information. So I think they've made the right decision in this case to show it just to the key members. President
has been talking land strikes. Land strikes in Venezuela as part of a new phase that could also include the seizure of additional oil tankers. I suspect with the way you work, you have a pretty good idea of what these land strikes, if the president decides to follow through on them, might include. Are these drug manufacturing facilities? Are these sites in the middle of a jungle? Are these anti-aircraft installations? Or is it all of the above?
Probably all of the above. Now, we know the president has been briefed on those options. He was briefed, I think, back in early November. So they're locked and loaded. Yeah. He's got the aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford there. He has plenty of strike assets in the region. The question is what he wants to do. Clearly, this is partly to put pressure on Maduro. If there was a strike option, I think it would focus on drug manufacturing facilities, anti-aircraft defenses, if there are any that are up and working. Every one of those targets, though, Joe, would have been carefully pre-vetted legally by the targeteering to minimize collateral damage and all that. You know, that's already in the options package that the chairman will have briefed to the president.
It looks like we might get war powers votes in both the House and Senate, potentially by the end of the week. There's a resolution set to ripen in the House. Senator Gallego has one ready for the Senate. If leadership brings it to the floor, would either pass?
I doubt it. And again, the president is the commander-in-chief. Yeah. He's got the constitutional authority because he has declared the cartel of the Suns, another cartel, and all this mix of the Venezuelan government and military working with Colombian guerrillas, working with the narco-traffickers. They've all been declared as enemy combatants. So you can argue whether you like that or not, but that legal justification through the Constitution is pretty clear. That's where the Office of Legal Counsel opinion that's been seen by a lot of representatives has laid that down already.
Many thanks for your take, as always. Rebecca Grant, Vice President of the Defense Programs at the Lexington Institute, with us live in Washington. Thank you. Coming up, the administration taking a new approach to defending the constructions of the White House ballroom. We'll bring you those details and talk it out with Ty Cobb, former special counsel to President Trump in the first administration. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. A city captivated by a rare series of candid interviews by the woman said to be the second most powerful person in Washington, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, whose remarks about the president, his cabinet, and the inner workings of the White House were published today in Vanity Fair. She referred to the president's alcoholic personality, said his name is in the Epstein files, called Elon Musk an odd duck and ketamine user, and described the huge disagreement, in her words, over President Trump's tariffs. The White House quickly looking to downplay the remarks from the interview, with Wiles saying in a social media post that significant context was disregarded in what she called a disingenuously framed hit piece. Joining us now with his perspective is Ty Cobb, the former federal prosecutor and former special counsel to President Trump in the first administration. Ty, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Does the composite, at least, that was described in this piece resemble the administration that you once worked for?
Oh, no. There were real guardrails. There was a real chief of staff. Susie Wiles, I think in these interviews struggled to try to establish some dignity for herself, some distance from the narcissistic, vengeful exercise that, Trump has undertaken and the people who support that, and Elon Musk's, chaotic destruction of USAID. I mean, that distance is important because USAID's dissimulation, coupled with the craziness from RFK Jr. at HHS, is estimated to going to kill 14 million people, which even Hitler couldn't achieve that. So I think some of these interviews of people who are there, if they're being truthful, and she was at least partially truthful until today when she tried to suggest some of these things weren't said and some of them were out of context. I mean, there are tapes of these interviews, it's pretty clear she said all this stuff. They have to downplay it because, frankly, what she said is true in many respects and worse than what she said in others.
Wow. All right. Well, you just said a lot there, Ty. Where to pick up on Susie Wiles? This is interesting. You referred to having a real chief of staff then. She's widely regarded as being a loyal soldier. someone who does not speak out of school. We remember the night that President Trump won the second term, she wouldn't even walk up to the microphone when he invited her. But incredible honesty, if we take Vanity Fair at its word, and to your point, these conversations were recorded, to say openly that the president was simply wrong about Bill Clinton and the Epstein files. What do you make of this casual honesty in such a forum by the chief of staff?
So I think that comment, coupled with her suggestion that he has an alcoholic personality. I'm not really sure what an alcoholic personality is. He definitely suffers from acute narcissistic personality disorder, and there's suggestions recently by psychiatrists and others knowledgeable in the area that he's exhibiting serious signs of dementia and other physical deterioration. So clearly, what he does is bizarre. Clearly, the media struggles with how far to go with that. They often sane-wash some of the things he does, but she actually was almost candid about how weird things are in the administration, between Vance's conspiracy theories, Musk's ketamine addiction. I mean, she sort of aired some of these things out in a way that people people need to understand that it's real. It's craziness what's going on.
Does this read like an exit interview to you, Ty, or she's going to be in the White House for many more months having done these interviews?
Trump doesn't fire loyalists. I mean, Pete Hegseth every day establishes a new level of incompetence that wouldn't have been tolerated, for 24 hours by any other president. And Pam Bondi as well. Even, of course, Susie Wiles was very candid about Pam Bondi. I don't think anybody in the administration has said a good word about Pam Bondi in months. So I think, but Susie is very, very loyal to the president. She does a good job of what he needs, which is, to try to keep the trains running. They don't run on time, but they're running to some degree. It is an odd White House now. People walk in and out of the Oval Office, in sort of an undisciplined manner, and you see these just bizarre comments coming from the president that nobody intercepts or prevents. I mean, most recently, of course, the despicable, shocking, and unprecedented dancing on Rob Reiner's grave and that of his wife. Wow. By the president merely because that the Reiners opposed his policies and the racism and other issues at the White House. So I mean, it's just those are the kind of comments no president in history would have ever made. No man, woman in history should have ever made those comments. But they come out, and they come out weekly, if not daily. And that
administration was back in court today.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Ty. I only have about a minute left. I just have to ask you about this case involving the ballroom. The president fired his hand-picked architect, as you know, and the ballroom is underway with, I guess, a more enhanced design. Having been sued, there's a legal challenge by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They want this to freeze in place before more can be done. The White House is invoking national security, that it must be built on the grounds of national security. Considering the fact that this is on the White House grounds, Ty, in our remaining moment, is there some truth to that?
No, there's zero truth to that. Now, there is a bunker there that has some national security issues, but they don't have to build the ballroom to protect the bunker. But Trump always invokes national security. In fact, your last guest, Ms. Grant, talked about the OLC memo that Trump has said that people are that they're worthy war targets when legally they aren't, and it's largely made up. So national security invocation is sort of the last resort of trying to say I can break the rules because of national security. I think the court's going to impose some rules.
Well, we'll see how this shapes up, Ty. We'd like to talk to you when we learn about it. Ty Cobb, former special prosecutor, former special counsel to President Trump. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Absolute BS is how Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York is labeling House Republicans' decision to not hold an Obamacare subsidies vote this week, except he used the full word. Lawler telling reporters after a closed-door meeting with lawmakers yesterday, quote, "I think it's idiotic to not have an up or down vote on this issue. It is political malpractice," unquote. Lawler is not the only one feeling that way, as a number of endangered Republicans in next year's midterms blast their party leadership as the subsidies get set to expire at the end of this month. A vote on separate Republican planning is set to take place tomorrow. Joining us now with the latest ahead of that vote is Bloomberg's Erik Wasson. He's live on Capitol Hill. Erik, it was an important day today. Now we have a better sense of how this is going to work. Will the Republican plan get a vote tomorrow, and would that do anything to help people's premiums from rising?
The Republican plan is slated to get a vote. Republicans say it will overall lower costs. In fact, the CBO does say, Congressional Budget Office, that it does lower budget deficits, but it also would increase the number of uninsured. The drama, though, is about this potential moderate Republican amendment that could be allowed a floor vote. As we reported in Bloomberg earlier, Speaker Johnson came out and told reporters it would not get a vote. Then he had this heated discussion this early afternoon with Mike Lawler, as you mentioned, and other moderate Republicans getting a lot of pushback. He came out to say maybe there can be a vote. They're wrangling over what kind of pay-fors would be added to this extension of Obamacare subsidies. They waived this pay-go law to pass their $4 trillion tax cut, but they're insisting on pay-fors for this. However, the pay-fors that they are talking about were likely anathema to Democrats. So, this amendment could be given a vote, but it could be designed in a way that it would fail. This would give some political cover to swing district moderates, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is it still looks unlikely that the Obamacare premium subsidies will be extended before they expire at the end of this year, and some 20 to 24 million Americans will see their net premiums go up.
It's a remarkable number, Erik. Even if something did, in fact, pass in the House to extend Obamacare subsidies, there'd still be the matter of the Senate, right? So even if the House got this done, we still go over the cliff.
Yeah, it's jet fumes in the Senate. They're looking to leave town on Thursday. A group of bipartisan senators met last night, led by Susan Collins and Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. They're talking about coming up with a deal, but even they acknowledge it would be January at this point. And as Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said, the toothpaste is already out of the tube by then. You've already seen, people foregoing insurance coverage, potentially, reaching in the millions of people going uninsured. So, we're going over the cliff, it looks like, but there could be some after-action, moves in January to try to save this, especially if Republicans go home for Christmas and feel pressure from their constituents in their districts.
Erik, thank you. Bloomberg's Erik Wasson live on Capitol Hill. On the early edition of Balance of Power today, I spoke with Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, about the state of these health care negotiations with his Democratic colleagues before the end of this congressional year. Take a listen.
What the Democrats have been pushing, in fact, there was a vote last Thursday in the United States Senate that failed 51-48, I believe is what it was, on a 3-year current extension. The waste, fraud, and abuse within the Obamacare exchanges just in the last 2 weeks was highlighted by the GAO report that said 59,000 dead people were being subsidized. One Social Security number had 127 different policies attached to it. And the GAO also attempted with fake identities and fake Social Security numbers to enroll in the program, and 100% of them were accepted and 90% were still being subsidized a year later this year. These reforms have to be addressed. You cannot just extend it. And the worst statistic that people should be paying attention to, of the 24 million people on the exchanges, last year alone, nearly 12 million never even filed a medical claim.
But of course, none of that will keep people's premiums from rising, certainly those who are receiving coverage through the Affordable Care Act. And joining us now with her reaction from the other side of the aisle, House Minority Whip, Democratic Congresswoman Katherine Clark of Massachusetts. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. There is another path here that we're well aware of. If this amendment is not allowed to get a vote to extend Obamacare subsidies, there's also a discharge petition that I know Hakeem Jeffries and yourself are welcoming moderate Republicans to sign on to. This would, in fact, extend Obamacare subsidies. Congresswoman, as the party's whip, can you give us a sense of where we are? Are we still at 214? Will more Republicans sign on to this plan?
We are at 214, which means we only need 4 Republicans And there are far more than 4 who are saying we should extend these tax credits. So we are saying to them, now is the time to do it. We have 3 days left of session before we recess for the holidays and just days before this tax credit expires. We don't know where they've been. They voted for the bill back in July that ended these tax credits and let them expire. And at the same time, they are making tax cuts for the very wealthiest Americans permanent and not requiring that there be any offset in the budget for the trillions of dollars that that is going to cost. So now is the time, because we are hearing it across Massachusetts and across the country. People are hurting. They are not able to afford this dramatic doubling, tripling, even quadrupling of insurance premiums. This is a healthcare crisis the GOP has caused. We have the vehicle for them to fix it today.
Well, you know, I asked Jason Smith what he was hearing from Obamacare recipients in his state of Missouri, and he made the point that there were so few in his state that it really wasn't an issue. I'm curious what happens when a line cook from Kelly's Roast Beef on Revere Beach calls your office. What do you tell them on the constituent services line is about to happen?
Yeah, we're telling them that we are fighting for them. And let me tell you that already in Massachusetts, we know that 10,000 people have opted out of the ACA because they can't afford to stay on that insurance. These are people, these are small businesses. These are people who need to be able to take a child to a doctor, to ensure their spouse can continue their cancer treatments, to manage their diabetes. I cannot stress how anxious and worried people are. And this is layered on top of watching cost of living continuing to rise. The Republicans are doing nothing to address this. In fact, the policies that they have green-lighted, like Donald Trump's tariff policies, the cuts to Medicaid, this cuts to the ACA tax credit, to veterans' health benefits, to food programs, all of this is putting even more economic pressure on American families. In this holiday season, come together, do the right thing by the American people, and help them keep and afford health insurance.
What do you think, Congresswoman? Will this discharge petition hit the floor before everybody heads home for the year?
I'm going to remain hopeful. We're very much watching the process that is going on as we speak in committee, where Republicans are putting forth their amendments on how to extend these tax credits. I hope that if that is not successful for them, and certainly the indications from Republican leadership is it won't be, but we'll see, then the next logical choice for them is for 4 of them to come and join us so we can force a vote and do right by the American people who are counting on us.
You know, the president has told us he plans to address the nation tomorrow in prime time. We haven't seen that too often from this president, to do a prime time, I presume, an Oval Office address. We'll see what the venue is, Congresswoman. Is there any expectation on Capitol Hill that he shows up with a health care plan and directs members, Republican members on Capitol Hill to vote for it?
Well, I'm certainly hoping for a holiday miracle, but I don't know what the subject will be. But what we are seeing and hearing from his own chief of staff in an article that dropped today is that the White House continues to be chaotic. It continues to be unlawful. The president continues to just respond to world events in a vile and disgusting way, as he did with the horrible murders we saw in LA. And he's unhinged. So I certainly hope that somebody has gotten to him and said, the American people need you to keep your promise to lower costs and to make sure they have health care. But we've seen no sign of that in nearly a year of this administration. And he has done everything in his power to make things harder and more expensive for American families.
Well, speaking of reacting to things happening around the world, Congresswoman, there was an important and classified briefing for lawmakers today by members of the administration. We saw the Defense Secretary, Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs march up to Capitol Hill to make the case for whatever mission is unfolding in the Caribbean. Did they succeed in making that case, and what is the mission around Venezuela?
I will tell you this, that this briefing was both long overdue and highly disappointing. And what we are asking from this administration is that they have to remember that Congress needs to be informed. Congress, they should be sharing their intelligence with us. Congress is the one that can declare war. And this president needs to open up that line of communication and be honest and transparent. And the way to do that is to start by releasing the video of this second strike on the boat in the Caribbean that has been so controversial. The president said he would do it, and we saw Secretary Hegseth walk that back today. We thought we might be able to see that video in this classified briefing, and we were disappointed, to say the least, that they are not fulfilling that. This is about keeping our troops and the American people safe, and they cannot take Congress out of the equation.
I spoke with your colleague Jim McGovern a couple of days ago here on Balance of Power, Congresswoman, about his War Powers resolution that's set to ripen and hit the floor as soon as this week. We know there are competing bills in the Senate as well. Will there be a vote on a War Powers Act?
We are actually going to be voting on two War Powers Acts. Jim McGovern, which is directing the president not to proceed without Congress in Venezuela, and Gregory Meeks, who is going to be addressing in his War Powers resolution the strikes on these boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. So we will be taking up a vote, and we will have a strong yes vote from all of the Democrats.
I'll be deeply curious to see if any Republicans sign on to that or vote yes. House Minority Whip, Democratic Congresswoman Katherine Clark of Massachusetts. We thank you, Congresswoman, for joining us on Bloomberg. Coming up, the latest from Rhode Island amid the ongoing manhunt following the deadly shooting at Brown University. And an update from Los Angeles following the Reiners deaths. Plus, Susie Wiles dishing to Vanity Fair and her pushback immediately after. We'll dive into it all with our political panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. We'll turn back to the latest in Washington ahead with our political panel. But first, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The manhunt in Rhode Island has now entered its fourth day after a gunman opened fire and killed 2 people, injured 9 at Brown University. And that investigation is now intensifying after police released a new image of their person of interest. Following a new video out last night, officials seeking the public's help in finding this suspect. A previous person of interest was questioned and released. Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner, will be charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and the killing of his parents. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office announcing the charges today after Reiner was arrested Sunday night. Prosecutors also noting they are still determining whether to seek the death penalty against the son of the acclaimed Hollywood couple. The EU is proposing to soften their emissions rules for new cars in response to months of pressure from the auto industry. The new proposal will reverse an effective ban on combustion engines, allowing car makers to slow the rollout of electric vehicles and continue to sell gas-powered cars past the year 2035, though they retain their goal of climate neutrality by 2050. This loosening of restrictions is meant to boost the Euro auto industry as trade tensions with the U.S. and China persist. Finally, the New York Times asking a judge to dismiss President Trump's $15 billion defamation lawsuit, arguing that the implausible allegations, their words, will not overcome First Amendment protections. That request from the Times coming just a day after Trump sued the BBC for $10 billion, accusing the organization of defamation over the editing of his January 6th speech featured in a documentary. Joining us now with their reaction to all the stories we're following today in Washington, our political panel. Chen is with us, Republican strategist and American Public Policy Studies fellow at the Hoover Institution, alongside Democratic strategist Kristen Hawn, partner at Rock Solutions. It's great to have you both here with 4 remaining legislative days of the year. It all has to happen this week if it's going to happen at all. Kristen, you've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and at times like these, as a longtime Blue Dog Democrat, I'm wondering your thoughts on what's about to happen, because we're told we're already going over the cliff. Whether Republicans bring a bill to the floor or not this week, what's going to happen to people's premiums in the new year?
I mean, a lot of nothing's going to happen on Capitol Hill, and I think people's premiums are going to go up. I think that the writing's been on the wall for a very long time. You're running up against the holiday, and people are going to go home. And the thing is, they're no closer to an agreement, and it needs to be a bipartisan agreement. You've seen what's gone on with the moderates. And as a moderate on the Democratic side, when we've had the majority in the House, too, you're pushing your leadership to try to work with the other side, or at least some people with the other side, to just help you out. And I believe these people are actually doing it for the right reasons. And also politically, it's damaging to them if they don't get something done. So unfortunately, I don't think you'll see, much of anything get done. And the Democrats aren't willing to vote for something that isn't what they've said they've wanted all along, which is a 2-year extension.
Well, here we are with a Blue Dog Democrat and a moderate Republican who worked once for Mitt Romney. So bring us to the middle here. Chen, is it possible for Democrats to pull moderate Republicans away from Speaker Johnson and sign on to this discharge petition that we've been discussing? Katherine Clark seemed very unsure whether it would get to the floor. All she needs is 4 or 5 R's to make it work.
Well, I think the challenge will be how much of the electoral politics run into the reality that Republicans have wanted to be unified, and they've been unified on the Obamacare issue in terms of opposition to Obamacare, opposition to extending the subsidies. So I think the critical question now is whether the electoral calculus motivates those few Republicans that are who are in swing districts to basically figure out a way to at least get an up or down vote on this, because the reality is this is going to be a campaign issue in 2026. This is going to be an issue that's weaponized. Democrats have already signaled that. And so this is really all about how much electoral protection those vulnerable Republicans are going to get. And I don't, President Trump's ultimately the guy who's going to have to step in and either cut a deal or essentially bless this operation for these moderate Republicans to get this vote.
Interesting. Weaponized. Just quickly, as a Republican, do you believe Democrats want to see Obamacare subsidies extended? Because a lot of Republicans come on this show and say this is exactly what they need to win the midterms. They don't want this to be handled now.
Well, I think the Democrats recognize how hard it is to get Republicans to a place where they will vote for an extension.
Sure.
They've never, ever voted for any part of Obamacare. So the notion that they would now vote for an extension is highly implausible. This has become a political tool. There's no question in my mind about it. The result of what's about to happen, there are policy outcomes, there are policy implications, but I think it's all about the politics now.
Okay. What do you make of this Machiavellian talk that suggests the worst of both parties?
Well, I mean, I would also say it is very, very difficult to get Republicans to go along with it. So there are a lot of people who are arguing on the Democratic side, why would we ask for a 1-year extension, which there is a compromise out there, when we're just going to be in the exact same position less than a year from now, 6 months from now, arguing about the exact same thing. So, I agree with this Machiavellian.
You do?
No. To some extent, there's always politics at play. I think with regard to this specific issue, healthcare is so personal to Americans. I would not live and work in Washington, D.C. if I didn't think that there were people on both sides of the aisle who are actually concerned about the American people and what they're about to go through. And I wouldn't say that every single person of the Democratic Party is just thinking about the politics only.
I mean, look, ultimately, it is a big affordability issue. If you think about how most Americans evaluate affordability, it's housing, food, and health care. And this is one of the big three. And that's going to be the issue of 2026. Regardless of whether you're talking about health care or any of the other issues I mentioned, the lens through which all this will be viewed is, are these things affordable? Healthcare costs have continued to escalate. Now we're seeing upward pressure on food costs, upward pressure on housing costs in some part of the country. So to me, it's entirely about the politics, because affordability is the issue in 2026 and probably beyond as well.
The issue that got this president elected, helped to dispatch the last, and maybe bringing him in front of the American people tomorrow night. What do you think of the timing of this address? I'm assuming it comes out of the Oval. We'll see tomorrow evening, prime time, 9 p.m., the president addressing the American people about what?
We were just talking, I think it's anybody's guess.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to be some elaborate health care proposal because
You don't?
I don't think the House and Senate have vetted anything like this. You know, there are leaks all over the place.
Yeah.
You know, he could come out and talk
Venezuela
about he has a new coin. You know, I mean, I'm not kidding. You know, he could come out and talk about his new stakes. I mean, I'm being a little bit, you know, trying to be funny about this, but you really don't know what he's going to say. And I'm not sure that any of us do until a few minutes beforehand.
Which makes you wonder why reach for the primetime address. That's kind of a sacred venue for a president of the United States. What do you think he does with it? Is this an announcement that something maybe has begun in Venezuela, or is it domestically focused? Is it an update for the holidays?
It could be a holiday message.
It
I
could.
don't know. I mean, look, I don't think it's an exigent foreign policy issue because that, you know, to give that much advance notice would seem strange.
Understood.
To me, I think this is probably something around the affordability issue. You saw the vice president give a speech, was it today or yesterday, where the focus is affordability, really on message, really tight. Same assessment as the president, by the way. This is an A++++ economy. I'm sure you're going to hear the same thing from the president in his speech at some point. But, yeah, look, we could theorize all day about what this thing is on. But I think that it would be politically savvy for this White House to begin to focus that message a little bit as we get to the end of the year and into the beginning of next year, that they have a plan for affordability.
And the vice president is very much more on message.
Well, it was a pretty different speech than what we heard a week ago. Will the president say, if this is an affordability address, that affordability is a Democrat con job? That's been the line so far, that it's a hoax.
He's going to have to reverse course on that because it's just not true and people aren't buying it. I mean, I actually couldn't believe my ears when he said, you know, it's the Democrat hoax, affordability, because people are feeling it. And just because you tell them the economy is working doesn't mean that they feel it when they go to the grocery store. I mean, it's the economy, like Lanhee said, it's the economy, it's healthcare. And that's what people are going to be caring
It'll also
about.
be 3 days before the Epstein files are supposed to be released. Well, look, maybe there's an announcement every day between now and then to keep our eyes off the ball.
Yeah, I think it'll be more that Americans don't need 6 apples; they only need 3, because the reality.
Then Kristen will start making advertisements.
I need $30.
Yeah, but this is that is one element of the message. I'm not sure will be in the speech.
You don't need 37 pencils, Lanhee, Chen.
I know. Well, I certainly don't.
Well, I get the president agrees with you. Will there be a message of abundance, to use a different term than affordability?
I'm sure, you know, he'll try to talk about those types of things. But, like, again, you cannot tell people what they don't have just because you said it.
Yeah.
And there are cracks in that right now.
Yeah, the last president figured that out, too. Kristen, Hawn, Lanhee, Chen, great conversation. Thank you to our great panel. And we invite you to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online to follow all the stories we've been talking about this evening. We'll meet you back here tomorrow. It'll be a big one, and we may still be speculating on that primetime address. We'll meet you back here then on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.